right, diving in today, folks. We're taking a close look at a figure who might not be a household name, but trust me, he's worth getting to know. Samuel Alexander.
Samuel Alexander, that's right. Born in 1859, died in 1938. Spent a good chunk of his life wrestling with some pretty big philosophical questions. And he ended up making a real splash in British thought, especially in the early 1900s.
Exactly. And for our listeners who are, into philosophy, we're going deep on Alexander's British emergentism.
Yeah, emergentism. It's this really fascinating idea, the idea that mind, consciousness, all that jazz, it kind of bubbles up, emerges from the material world, from matter, basically.
And that might sound pretty straightforward at first glance, but Alexander wasn't just some simple materialist.
Oh, absolutely not. See, he's often lumped in with those new realists, think Bertrand Russell and that crowd. But Alexander had this whole other layer to him, coming from a background steeped in British idealism.
Right, the idealists, like Bradley, Bosanquet, that crew. So he was grappling with these two big, often opposing schools of thought, which honestly makes him even more interesting, don't you think?
Without a doubt. It's in that tension and that back and forth where you find the real gems. And that's what we're digging into today. The heart of Alexander's mature thought laid out in his 1920 book, Space, Time, and Deity.
Space, Time, and Deity. Gotta love a title like that. So our mission, if you choose to accept it, dear listener, is to break down the foundations of his philosophical system, see how he pulls together realism and this idea of emergentism.
And why, frankly, he was considered such a big deal in British philosophy. He wasn't just some obscure thinker scribbling in a corner.
Not at all. He was a major player. Okay, so before we go full metaphysician, let's back up a bit. Who is Samuel Alexander the man? Where did he come from? What shaped his thinking?
Well, like you said, he wasn't British, born and bred, surprisingly. Started out down under, born to a Jewish family in Australia. Later on, they moved to Melbourne. And that's where things start to get interesting for the philosophy nerds among us.
How so? Melbourne to Oxford? Is that what happened?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
He ends up going to England for his education, lands at Oxford, Balliol College to be precise. And that's where he really gets steeped in this whole British idealist thing.
The hallowed halls of Balliol. Breeding ground for philosophers, it seems. So he's rubbing shoulders with the Bradleys, with Bosanquet, diving deep into Hegel and Plato. That's some serious philosophical firepower.
No kidding. And it's crucial to remember this background because later on, he he veers sharply away from that whole idealist camp, embraces realism. And that shift is even more dramatic because of how deeply he was initially into idealism.
That's a heck of a U-turn. So what prompted it? Was there like an aha moment, a philosophical epiphany?
Well, it wasn't a sudden thing, more like a gradual evolution. But a key turning point seems to have been his time in Germany.
Germany? Okay, tell me more about that. What was he doing there?
So he spent some time in Berlin, gets interested in the work of Hermann von Helmholtz. Now, Helmholtz, he was a big deal in physiological psychology. Really focused on the science of perception, how we actually see and hear and all that.
Right, the nuts and bolts of how our senses work.
Exactly. And then, even more interesting, Alexander gets some hands-on experience in Hugo Münsterberg's psychology lab over in Freiburg. So he's not just reading about these things, he's actually in the lab, seeing experiments, getting that empirical grounding.
Fascinating. So it's like this blend of, armchair philosophy and actual scientific observation. He's trying to bridge that gap.
You got it. And that empirical influence, that hands-on stuff, it really shows up in his later thinking, especially his emergentist views. But that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves.
Fair enough. Let's stick with Alexander the man for a minute. What about his academic life?
Well, he ends up with a long career at the University of Manchester, becomes quite a prominent figure there. And here's something I find particularly interesting. Even as his own views shifted away from idealism, he never completely shut the door on those conversations.
Really? So he's debating with the idealists, even though he's staking out his own territory.
Exactly. He kept up correspondence with guys like Bradley and Bosanquet, debated with them, challenged them, but also, I think, respected them.
That speaks volumes about his intellectual honesty, doesn't it? He's not afraid to engage with opposing views, even when he's passionately advocating for his own. Okay, so let's dive into the good stuff. Emergentism and realism. What's the essence of Alexander's take on these?
All right, so realism first. This is where he makes a clean break from idealism. Alexander's a firm believer that the world exists independently of our minds. It's not just some mental construct. Things exist whether we perceive them or not.
Okay, so far so good. But didn't you say he was lumped in with the new realists? How's his realism different?
Right, so here's the nuance, and this is important for our philosophically minded listeners. Alexander's realism had this extra dimension, a flavor, you might say, that sets him apart from folks like Russell. And it all comes down to this idea of compresence.
Compresence. Okay, lay it on me. What's that all about?
So for Alexander, minds aren't these isolated things locked away in their own little mental worlds. Instead, minds exist in the world, alongside other things. We're compresent with tables, chairs, mountains, whatever. We directly encounter them, not just some mental representation of them.
Direct encounter, no intermediaries. I like it. So it's like, to use a really bad analogy, we're not looking at a photo of the mountain, we're standing right there in front of it.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. He even uses this analogy of a table and a floor. Both exist in the same space, directly related to each other. That's how he sees the relationship between mind and object, direct and immediate.
Okay, I'm following so far. But here's the thing. If we're directly experiencing the world, how does he explain perceptual errors? We all make mistakes. We misinterpret things. How does that work if there's no gap between mind and object?
Great question, and Alexander tackles it head on. He introduces this idea of enjoyment.
Enjoyment? Like, I'm enjoying this conversation.
Not quite, though I'm glad you are.
Yeah.
He uses enjoyment in a very specific way. It's about our awareness of our own perceiving. We don't just passively receive information. We actively engage in the process. We enjoy it, in a sense.
Okay, so we're conscious of ourselves perceiving. How does that solve the problem of error?
Well, for Alexander, errors don't arise from some faulty representation in our minds. They come from applying a partial perception to the whole thing. Like, imagine you're feeling a table in the dark. You might correctly perceive a smooth surface, but incorrectly assume the whole table is smooth. The perception itself wasn't wrong, but your judgment based on it was.
So it's a matter of, like, incomplete information or jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. We're not cut off from the world representations, but we can still misinterpret what we perceive. It's a subtle but important point in his direct realist framework.
Got it. So we've got this mind directly experiencing the world, capable of both accurate perceptions and occasionally good old-fashioned blunders. But how does this mind actually come into being? Where does it fit into this whole scheme of things?
That's where emergentism comes in. And this is where his earlier interest in psychology and evolution really shines through. For Alexander, mind isn't just some random thing that pops up out of nowhere. It emerges from lower-level living organisms through this long, gradual process of evolution.
Okay, so we're talking about, like, biological complexity reaching a certain threshold and bam, mind appears.
Pretty much. He's careful to point out that it's not just a rearrangement of existing physical stuff, it's a genuinely new quality that comes into being. Like, he compares it to the way color emerges from light vibrations.
Interesting analogy. So specific frequencies of vibrations create this whole new experience of color. And in a similar way, a certain level of biological complexity gives rise to the experience of mind.
Exactly. And this idea actually has roots in his earlier work on ethics, where he saw moral principles as emerging from social interactions. So he's applying this concept of emergence across different domains.
So emergence is like this recurring theme for him, popping up in different areas of his thinking. Okay, so we've got mind emerging from life. But what's the foundation of it all? Where does life itself come from?
For Alexander, the ultimate bedrock, the ground floor of reality, if you will, is space and time.
Space and time, not like matter or energy.
Nope. Space and time. He argues that they're not just empty containers, but the very stuff, the fundamental ingredients of everything else. And this, my friend, brings us to his big, ambitious book, Space, Time, and Deity.
Space, Time, and Deity. Man, that title just keeps getting better. So what's the central argument of this book? What's Alexander trying to convince us of?
Well, right off the bat, he lays out his core thesis. All the big, thorny problems in philosophy, they all boil down to how we understand space and time. And for him, space and time aren't separate things. They're woven together into this four-dimensional fabric he calls space-time, or motion.
Four-dimensional fabric. Okay, we're officially in heady territory now, so it's like our regular 3 dimensions of space plus time is the 4th dimension.
Precisely. But here's the catch. This motion itself doesn't move. It's the framework within which all movement happens.
Wait, so it's everything, but it doesn't move. That's kind of mind-bending.
I know, right? And it actually has some interesting parallels to how certain idealists, like Bradley, talked about the absolute, this all-encompassing reality that's not in time, but contains time. So there's a hint of that idealist influence still lingering in Alexander's thought.
A little ghost of idealism past. Okay, so he says space and time are unified. But how does he argue for that? Why can't we just think of them as separate things?
His argument hinges on their interdependence. He says if you try to pull them apart, they just fall apart. Time without space is just a bunch of isolated nows with no connection or context. And space without time is just an empty void, a blank slate.
So it's like they need each other to make sense. Like time gives space its dynamism and space gives time its structure.
That's a good way to put it. It's in their union, their merging into motion, that we get both the flow of time and the differentiation of space. And both of those are absolutely essential to how we experience the world.
Makes sense. But was this whole idea of a unified space-time just a philosophical abstraction, or did it have any connection to what scientists were thinking at the time?
Oh, Alexander was very much in tune with the science of his day. He explicitly drew connections to the work of Hermann Minkowski, a physicist who was developing a four-dimensional model of the universe. So he's not just off in his own philosophical world. He's trying to ground his ideas in what contemporary physics was suggesting about the nature of reality.
So he's weaving together philosophy and science, trying to create a coherent picture of the universe. Pretty ambitious.
No kidding. And it's part of what made him such a compelling figure. He was a serious philosopher, but he was also paying attention to what was happening in the world of science.
All right, so we've got this foundational space-time, but Alexander also talks about these things called categorical characters. What are those, and how do they fit into his system?
Ah, yes, the categorical characters. These are like the fundamental ways in which we make sense of the world. Think of things like substance, causality, identity, number, universality. Big concepts, right?
Yeah, the kind of stuff philosophers love to argue about.
Exactly. And Alexander saw these as being deeply connected to the nature of space-time itself. He even linked them back to Kant's categories of experience.
Kant, the OG of categories.
Indeed. But for Alexander, these categories weren't just mental constructs that we impose on the world. They were grounded in the very fabric of reality itself.
So they're not just in our heads, they're out there in the world, somehow embedded in space-time.
That's the idea. Space-time is the ultimate source of everything, right? So its inherent properties, its structure, it's going to shape everything that emerges from it, including those fundamental categories we use to understand the world.
Okay, I'm starting to see how he's building this whole intricate system, but how does he explain the emergence of, well, everything else? We've talked about mind emerging from life, but what about matter, life itself? How do those arise from this foundational space-time?
So here's where he uses an analogy that he admits is imperfect, but still, I think, helpful. He says we should think about the emergence of these different levels of existence, like we think about the mind emerging from the body.
Okay, that's a pretty big analogy. Mind-body dualism is a whole philosophical rabbit hole in itself.
I know, right? Yeah. And he acknowledges that it's a complex issue. But the basic idea is this. As the patterns of motion within space-time become more and more intricate, new qualities emerge. Just like consciousness arises from a certain level of biological complexity, life emerges from non-living matter, and matter itself emerges from the fundamental motions of space-time.
So it's like this hierarchical view of reality driven by increasing complexity.
Exactly. And he even suggests that there's this inherent striving within space-time, a kind of dynamism pushing towards greater and greater complexity. Like the universe has this built-in tendency to evolve, to create new things.
Sounds almost like a kind of cosmic teleology, though I'm guessing Alexander wouldn't have framed it that way.
You're right, he probably wouldn't have used that language. But there's definitely a sense of directionality, of purposefulness in his view of the universe.
And what's the driving force behind this upward striving? What's pushing the universe towards greater complexity?
That's where he introduces the concept of the nisus.
The nisus. Okay, that's a new one. What exactly is that?
It's this inherent striving, a kind of felt tendency within space-time itself, towards the realization of higher and higher levels of existence. It's what drives the emergence of new qualities. And he argues that just as space-time has given rise to matter, life, and mind, this same nisus will continue to push the universe towards an even higher level of being. And that, he says, is what we call deity.
Deity. So God, he's bringing God into this whole cosmological scheme.
He is. But not the traditional way. For Alexander, deity isn't some pre-existing being who created the universe. It's the next emergent quality that the universe is striving to realize.
So God isn't out there somewhere, separate from the universe. He's like emerging from it.
Exactly. God is, as Alexander famously put it, being engendered. He's not a finished product, but a process, an ongoing becoming. And this God isn't just some abstract concept. He identifies God with the entire universe at a future stage of its development. The universe, as it's evolving, is God coming into being.
Wow, That's a pretty radical reinterpretation of the whole God idea. It's like he's naturalizing God, making him part of this grand evolutionary story.
Exactly. He's taking this concept that's usually seen as outside of the natural world and bringing it right into the heart of his naturalistic framework.
But what about all the traditional attributes of God, like being all-knowing, all-powerful, outside of time? How does that fit into this emergentist view?
Well, Alexander tackles those head on. For example, he argues that God is both spatial and temporal. He's not outside of space and time, but embedded within them. And this, he says, actually helps address certain theological problems, like the problem of evil.
The problem of evil, the classic head-scratcher. How can a good God allow suffering?
Right. And Alexander says that if God is still in the process of becoming, if he's not yet fully realized, then he's not responsible for the suffering that exists in the world. That suffering is part of the process, part of the universe's evolution towards this higher state of being.
So it's like God is in the trenches with us, so to speak, working through this whole messy process of becoming.
Exactly. And he further developed these ideas in his later essay, Theism and Pantheism. There he argues that his view allows for a God who is both transcendent, in the sense of being a future ideal, and immanent, in the sense of being grounded in the world as it is right now.
So God is both beyond us and within us, both the goal we're striving towards and the very process of striving itself.
That's a good way to put it. And this whole emergentist approach, it really sets him apart from traditional theism.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From his unique brand of realism to his mind-bending conception of space-time to his radical reinterpretation of God, it's clear that Alexander was a bold and original thinker. But what about his influence? Did his ideas catch on? Did they have a lasting impact?
Oh, absolutely. During his lifetime, he was considered a leading figure in British philosophy, especially after Bradley's death. And his influence can be seen in a surprisingly wide range of thinkers.
Like who? Give me some names.
Well, within the New Realist camp, you have people like Laird and Broad, who were clearly influenced by his ideas. Then you have Alfred North Whitehead, a big name in process philosophy, who also drew inspiration from Alexander. Even John Anderson, who's often considered the father of Australian philosophy, was heavily indebted to Alexander's work.
That's quite a lineup. So he wasn't just a flash in the pan. His ideas had real staying power.
Definitely. And it's interesting because his influence wasn't limited to one specific school of thought. You see traces of his thinking in realism, in process philosophy, even in some later idealist thinkers. That speaks to the breadth and depth of his work.
It's like he was planting seeds in all these different philosophical gardens. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our deep dive. Before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing. Alexander didn't just write about metaphysics, right? He had other interests as well.
That's right. He was a true polymath. In his later years, he delved into Spinoza's philosophy, trying to reinterpret it through his own emergentist lens. And he also wrote extensively on aesthetics, culminating in his book Beauty and Other Forms of Value.
Beauty and Other Forms of Value. What was his take on beauty?
He had a very naturalistic approach. He argued that values, including beauty, are essentially human constructions that arise from our basic instincts. He even drew comparisons between human art and things you see in the animal kingdom, like birdsong or bowerbird nests.
So even beauty for him was part of this grand evolutionary story. It's all connected.
Exactly. Everything, for Alexander, was ultimately grounded in the natural world, from the simplest physical phenomena to the most complex human experiences.
Well, I think it's safe to say that Samuel Alexander was a thinker who wasn't afraid to tackle the big questions. And he did it with rigor, with originality, and with a deep respect for both philosophical tradition and scientific inquiry.
Couldn't said it better myself. He was a true giant of his time, and his work continues to offer valuable insights for anyone grappling with the fundamental questions of existence. Whether you agree with him or not, there's no denying the power and scope of his vision.
So, for you, our listener, as we bring this philosophical journey to a close, I want to leave you with this thought. Alexander's vision of a universe driven by this nisus, this inherent striving towards higher forms of being. It's a powerful and, frankly, kind of hopeful idea. It suggests that we're not just random collections of atoms, but part of this grand unfolding story, a story that's still being written. And who knows what new and wondrous qualities might emerge as this story continues. It's a question worth pondering, a question that might just lead you down your own philosophical rabbit hole. And if you're feeling adventurous, I highly recommend picking up Space, Time, and Deity and diving headfirst into Alexander's remarkable world.
Yes, absolutely. Explore his ideas, wrestle with them, and see where they lead you. You might be surprised at what you discover.
And that's the deep dive for today. Until next time, keep thinking, keep exploring, and keep asking those big questions.